February 14th, 1986. Sugar Land, Texas. 43-year-old insurance agent Stephen Geri phones the mother of his 33-year-old wife, Marilu Geri, and asks her to visit Marilu at their house to help her prepare for a party. When Marilu's mother arrives, she discovers that her daughter has been shot 4 times. Since there were issues with the marriage, and Stephen stands to collect on a substantial life insurance policy for Marilu's death, he is viewed as a person of interest, but seems to have an alibi for the time of the murder. However, there is suspicion that Stephen's alibi may have been fabricated, but since there is no direct evidence to implicate him, Marilu's murder remains unsolved. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be covering a controversial case from the first season of Unsolved Mysteries, the 1986 murder of Marilu Geri. This is the story of a woman who was shot to death inside her own home, with her husband Stephen Geri being suspected of orchestrating the whole thing in order to cash in on a life insurance policy. While I remember watching the Unsolved Mysteries segment when it originally aired, I actually don't believe I ever saw the segment in reruns or syndication, and may not have watched it again until the show's first season was uploaded to Amazon Prime nearly 30 years later. But I think it helped reinvigorate interest in the case, as it has received some additional media coverage in recent years. On the surface, this might seem like one of those obvious, the husband did it crimes, but it's a bit more complicated than that. What makes this case unique is that on the surface, Stephen Geri seems to have a solid alibi during the time period Marilu was supposedly murdered, but the problem is his alibi almost seems too good, if that makes any sense. If he didn't do it, an alternate theory is that Stephen hired someone to kill his wife while he was away from the house, but no evidence has ever been found to support this. Regardless, there were enough suspicious things about Stephen that Marilu's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against him at one point, which only managed to generate even more unanswered questions about this case. It's also worth mentioning that the murder happened to take place on Valentine's Day, and since February the 14th is right around the corner, I thought this would be an ideal time to finally cover this. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the unsolved murder of Marilu Geri. Our story begins in 1986 in Sugar Land, Texas, a city located in South Bend County, just under 20 miles southwest of downtown Houston. Our central figure is 33-year-old Marilu Geri, who lives in an affluent home in the Tealbriar subdivision alongside her 43-year-old husband, Stephen Geri. The couple have been married for 3 years, and Stephen operates his own insurance business out of their home, with Marilu working for him. On the morning of Valentine's Day, Stephen left his house to run some errands and conduct his business before he called Marilu's mother, Maria Serrato, from a payphone at around 8:15 a.m. February the 14th also happened to be Maria's birthday, and Stephen told his mother-in-law that Marilu was planning a joint birthday/Valentine's Day party for her, so he asked Maria if she could go over to their house and help Marilu prepare for it. After their call ended, Maria attempted to phone her daughter, but was surprised when there was no answer. After failing to reach Marilu, Maria finally drove over to the Geri residence and was surprised to discover that the front door was unlocked. Maria walked inside and started searching the house for Marilu, but when she made it to the bathroom adjacent to the master bedroom, she was horrified to discover her daughter's body on the floor. She immediately checked Marilu and saw that she had multiple gunshot wounds, so Maria called for help at 10:06 a.m. The paramedics soon showed up and rushed Marilu to the hospital while they made an attempt to revive her, but it was already too late, and she was pronounced dead after they arrived. It would turn out that Marilu had been shot 4 times, 3 times in the neck and once in the side, but oddly, the bullets came from 2 different guns, a .380 caliber pistol and a .22 caliber pistol. Marilu was not sexually assaulted, and aside from a table being knocked over in the hallway, there were no signs of any forced entry or struggle inside the house. While some drawers were pulled out in the bathroom, nothing else appeared to be disturbed. Marilu's jewelry box was open, but numerous pieces of jewelry were lying around in plain sight, and she was still wearing some as well. On the surface, robbery did not seem to be the motive for this crime. However, Stephen would later dispute this, claiming that around $25,000 to $30,000 worth of valuables, including jewelry and fur coats, had been stolen from the home. But it wasn't long before Stephen himself became a potential suspect in the crime. While Stephen always maintained that his marriage to Marilu was a happy one, her parents, Maria and Miguel Serrato, disagreed, claiming that the relationship had been tumultuous for over 2 years and the couple often fought over money. Indeed, Stephen was known for spending beyond his means and was experiencing financial difficulties at the time of Marilu's death, which included over $120,000 of hard cash judgments against himself. It would also turn out that 2 years earlier, Stephen had taken out separate $435,000 insurance policies on both his and Marilu's lives, and he now stood to collect that money from his wife's policy. As a result, the Fort Bend County Sheriff's Office explored the possibility that Stephen could have been responsible for Marilu's murder. Stephen did own several handguns, but they were all tested by the police ballistics lab and were ruled out as having been used in the shooting. Stephen also provided a very detailed alibi for the morning of the crime. He claimed that he woke up at 5 a.m. because he had a really busy day scheduled and did some work on his home computer before leaving the house at around 6:25 or 6:30. Marilu was still in bed at the time, so he told her he would call her at 7 o'clock, and he was certain that the house's security system was still on when he left. He then ran a few errands, which included purchasing coffee from a 7-Eleven convenience store, picking up mail from the post office, and buying some donuts at a donut shop. Stephen next visited a company called Precision Glass and spoke to some of the people there until he realized it was nearly 7:30 and he had forgotten to call his wife. He then proceeded to phone Marilu from the company's reception desk, and he said she told him she was awake and busy doing work. From that point on, Stephen went about his business, which included his phone call to Maria Serrato at 8:15. During this 2.5-hour window, Stephen was almost always in the presence of other witnesses who could verify his whereabouts until Marilu's body was discovered shortly after 10 a.m. However, the Serratos were skeptical of Stephen's story and hired their own private investigator named Bill Elliott to look into the case. Elliott put a particular focus on Stephen's alibi and interviewed several witnesses, which uncovered some discrepancies to suggest that the alibi may have been fabricated. According to most people who knew him, it was very out of character for Stephen to leave his home as early as 6:30 a.m. He ran his insurance business from there, and it was common practice for him to start out the morning by doing work in his home office before leaving to visit clients at around 9 or 10 a.m. Elliot spoke to employees from the 7-Eleven Stephen claimed to have frequented after he left his home on the morning of the murder, but while they did confirm he was there, they also said he did not arrive until about 3 minutes before 7 o'clock. Since the convenience store was only 2 blocks away from the Geri residence and took less than 5 minutes to drive there, this seemed to open up a hole of around 20 to 25 minutes of unaccounted for time in Stephen's alibi. It also turned out that on the day after the crime, Stephen returned to all the locations he visited in order to remind everyone that he had been there the previous morning. But while these revelations raised some red flags, there was a major obstacle against determining whether Stephen could have been complicit in this crime. When the paramedics made an unsuccessful attempt to resuscitate Marilu while transporting her to the hospital, they injected a medication into her heart in an attempt to restart it. However, this procedure made it impossible to determine Marilu's exact time of death, so no one could prove if she was killed before or after Stephen left the house. In spite of the suspicions against him, Stephen would offer a $50,000 reward for information about his wife's murder, though the reward was later rescinded after Stephen's attorney claimed that he did not actually have the money to pay it. While police called Stephen a person of interest, they stopped short of actually calling him a suspect. Well, 10 months after the murder, Stephen finally made an attempt to collect on Marilu's $435,000 life insurance policy, which enraged the Serratos and compelled them to file a wrongful death lawsuit against him. Their petition stated that they, quote-unquote, had reason to believe and will prove that Stephen Geri intentionally and wrongfully caused the death. So the Serratos wanted to prevent Stephen from receiving any of the insurance money. Stephen denied these allegations, and at pretrial hearings stated that he would rather have his wife back than the money. In May of 1987, the case was about to go to trial, and the jury had just been selected when both sides suddenly decided to reach an out-of-court settlement. Stephen and the Serratos would each claim that it was the other who proposed the offer for the settlement, but since the judge ordered the records to be sealed for 2 years and imposed a gag order for both parties not to discuss the terms of the settlement publicly, it was impossible to verify which side was telling the truth. The case was featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries in December of 1988, but by that point, the 2-year window for unsealing the records had not yet passed, and as far as I can tell, details about the settlement have never been released publicly. Anyway, the month following the settlement, an $80,000 reward was offered for information, leading to an arrest and a conviction, but the authorities did not receive any new tips, and the reward was withdrawn after 1 year. But Stephen would find himself in legal trouble in November of 1987 when he was indicted by a Fort Bend County grand jury for felony theft after he allegedly bilked $200,000 from a Houston Savings Association after supplying false information on a loan application. Unfortunately, I've been unable to find out how that case ultimately turned out. There would be additional drama when Marilu's headstone at the cemetery was vandalized with mud, and it would later be stolen. This prompted Marilu's family to purchase a new headstone for her, only this time it read Marilu Serrato instead of Marilu Geri. In 1999, a cold case investigator from the Fort Bend County Sheriff's Department would take a fresh look at the case and said that even though he had developed a suspect, he was unable to uncover the necessary physical evidence to implicate them. The investigation once again reached a standstill, and Marilu's father, Miguel Serrato, eventually passed away. However, in 2018, on the 32-year anniversary of the crime, the Fort Bend County Sheriff's Office held a press conference in which they announced that evidence from the case was going to be re-examined. Marilu's brother, Louis Serrato, and her sister Diana were present at the press conference, and even though Maria Serrato is currently in a nursing home, a recorded statement from her was played in which she expressed the family's continued desire to obtain justice after all these years. A new $20,000 reward was offered for information, but even though the investigation is still ongoing, the murder of Marilu Geri continues to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So like I mentioned in the intro, when the first season of Unsolved Mysteries was uploaded to Amazon Prime in early 2017, this marked the first time I got to watch their segment about this case in nearly 30 years. The show featured its fair share of stories in which someone was accused of murdering or being responsible for the disappearance of a loved one, and all things considered, a surprising number of them were willing to be interviewed on camera on national television in order to respond to these allegations. And perhaps not surprisingly, the majority of them did not come across very well, and this includes Stephen Geri. Regardless of whether he's guilty or innocent of this crime, there's just something about him which seems off. I mean, I don't automatically expect everyone who lost their spouse to a horrible crime to become overly emotional every time they talk about it, but quite frankly, whenever I hear Stephen Geri speak, he comes across as someone who's reciting lines he's memorized from a script. It's so weird to watch the segment and hear Marilu's mother talk about how unhappy the Geris' marriage was, only for Stephen to counter with these robotic phrases such as, "It was the most fulfilling relationship that I've ever had with an individual," and "We allowed each other to develop to the fullest." Perhaps the oddest part of Stephen's interview is when he's asked why the Serratos hit him with a wrongful death lawsuit, and he responds, quote, "Well, there are two things that make the world go around, and that's sex and money. And it definitely wasn't sex, was it?" End quote. Who talks that way about parents whose daughter has been murdered? I just mentioned a press conference which was held about the case in 2018 and featured comments from Marilu's brother Louis and sister Diana. You can actually watch that entire press conference on YouTube, and there's one moment where Diana quotes that line from Stephen and seems very insulted and disgusted by the idea that her family was only going after him for his money. Diana and Louis make no secret of the fact that they clearly still believe that Stephen was behind Marilu's murder. All that being said, I'm not going to condemn Stephen and automatically accuse him of being guilty just because he came across badly in an interview. But before I start talking about the crime itself, I have to take a few moments to address a website he used to run at the domain StephenGeri.com. If you type in that address right now, you'll notice that the website is no longer up, for reasons which should become abundantly clear momentarily. Quite frankly, it seemed like the entire purpose of StephenGeri.com was to show the whole world how awesome Stephen Geri is. He has since remarried and is a proud parent and grandparent, and the website, which often referred to Stephen or Mr. Geri in the third person, constantly put over what a loving family man, smart businessman, and dedicated philanthropist he was. Quite frankly, it reeked of someone trying way too hard to convince the world that he's a good person, and if you believe he's gotten away with murder for the past 3 decades, then the whole thing is extra creepy. Even though the website is no longer up, you can still have a glimpse at it by using the Wayback Machine. But here's the interesting part. In early 2017, a statement suddenly appeared on the website which addressed Marilu's murder and the Unsolved Mystery segment. Of course, Stephen denied any involvement and claimed he had faced unfair accusations for the past 3 decades. He concluded his statement by writing, quote, "Unsolved Mysteries did not present the video correctly, and I never signed a release. The service selling this video operates below the line of integrity. It is full of lies and private interpretation. No truth." End quote. And here's another interesting portion of Stephen's statement that's worth quoting. "I would like to disclose something that has never been disclosed until now. At the hearing for distribution of the life insurance proceeds, I told the judge I wanted to donate the entire amount to the American Heart Association. This is documented by court records." End quote. I'm sure it's no coincidence that this statement went up only a few months after the segment was uploaded to Amazon Prime. Like I mentioned in the intro, this story did not get aired much during syndication, so I have no doubt there were a lot of new viewers watching it for the first time on Amazon who probably came across StephenGeri.com while Googling for additional information. I'm sure Stephen did not appreciate all the newfound attention, and this might explain why his website is no longer up. Well, if Stephen is truly innocent in this whole affair, and all the newfound attention to the case caused unwarranted harassment for himself and his family, then yes, I do feel bad for him. But this doesn't change the fact that the crime is still unsolved after all these years, so you'd think Stephen might be happy about the case being in the spotlight again, since it increases the chances of finding his wife's real killer. I will say that there's a decent chance Stephen did not actually commit the murder himself, but hired someone to do it. You might recall the episode I did just over 2 years ago about the murder of Donna Branyan, another controversial case which was featured on Unsolved Mysteries. Donna's husband, Dr. John Branyan, was charged and convicted of shooting her inside their home, but there was debate about whether he would have had enough time to commit the crime. As you might recall, there was a window of around 15 to 20 minutes between when Dr. Branyan left the hospital where he worked and when he picked up his son from school, and he always maintained that it would have been impossible for him to have driven home and killed his wife during that narrow time frame. I've always been inclined to think that's true, but I also believe there was enough suspicious evidence to suggest that Branyan could have hired someone else to commit the murder, though that was never conclusively proven. The same logic might apply to Stephen Geri, as this is another case in which establishing a precise timeline is very crucial. The main piece of evidence which convicted Branyan was the fact that a Walther PPK he denied ever owning vanished from his home without explanation, and 4 shells were also missing from a box of ammunition inside his closet, matching the number of times his wife was shot. The key difference with this crime is that even though Stephen owned several guns, it was conclusively established that none of them were used to shoot his wife, so the murder weapon has never been accounted for. Or should I say, murder weapons. One of the strangest details of this crime is the fact that Marilu was shot 4 times with bullets from 2 different guns, a .380 and a .22. If Stephen did it, he would have had to dispose of both guns himself, but let's start at the very beginning. One of the main reasons people became suspicious of Stephen is because he changed his routine and left his house a couple of hours earlier than normal, and it just seemed like quite a coincidence that on the one day he does this, someone else would enter his house and murder his wife. From what I gathered, since Stephen ran his insurance business from his home, it was typical for him to do work from his office after waking up in the morning before leaving at around 9 or 10 a.m. But on this particular morning, he left at around 6:30 a.m. because he had a busier day than normal planned. I don't know how a typical workday for Stephen would have played out, but I get the impression that his job entailed traveling around to various locations and visiting clients in order to sell them insurance. He claimed that after running some errands, he stopped at a company called Precision Glass, which I'm assuming is a client of his. This is where Stephen said he made his 7:30 phone call to Marilu, the last time he confirmed her to be alive. But the exact details of his whereabouts until her body was discovered at 10:06 are unclear. All we know is that Stephen was in the presence of witnesses who confirmed his alibi during this 2.5-hour window, so I'm guessing that he was visiting multiple clients to conduct his business. It seems like enough people saw him and accounted for his whereabouts that it would have been impossible for him to drive back home and kill Marilu during this particular time period. But one of the big red flags was Stephen's phone call to Maria Serrato at 8:15, where he asked her to visit the house and help Marilu prepare for a Valentine's Day/birthday party. On the surface, it would appear like Stephen was arranging for someone else to, quote-unquote, discover Marilu's body while he was away in order to help strengthen his alibi. If Marilu needed assistance, I don't understand why she wouldn't call her mother herself. And this was Maria's birthday, so why would you ask her to help prepare her own birthday party? I will say that if Stephen is guilty of this crime, the idea that he deliberately arranged for Maria to find her daughter's body on her own birthday is incredibly messed up. Of course, the other big red flag with Stephen's alibi is that the day after the murder, he returned to all the places he'd visited while running errands the previous morning, including the 7-Eleven, post office, and donut shop, to remind everyone he had been there. I mean, it's nice that he wants to account for his whereabouts, but I think that most people who had just gone through the trauma of having their spouse murdered would not even be thinking of details like that. It comes across like Stephen's visits to all these places were pre-planned and that he's trying way, way too hard to establish an alibi for himself. Incidentally, I don't know how accurate this detail is, but in the Unsolved Mysteries reenactment, the actor playing Stephen is shown asking for a receipt from the cashier at the donut shop. I'm not quite sure why he would need a receipt after purchasing donuts, so if this actually happened, it's another thing which suggests he was attempting to fabricate an alibi. I mean, if this crime took place today, I could totally see Stephen using Facebook check-in at all these locations. When questioned by the police, he would then try to establish his innocence by pulling up his Facebook feed, which would feature posts like, Stephen Geri is at 7-Eleven at 6:57 a.m., or Stephen Geri is at Dunkin' Donuts at 7:20 a.m. The biggest hole in Stephen's timeline is the fact that he places himself leaving his house at around 6:25, 6:30 a.m., but the employees at the 7-Eleven claimed he arrived there at 6:57, even though the place was less than a 5-minute drive away. Now, to be fair, these employees were interviewed by a private investigator hired by the Serrato family some time after the crime originally took place. People who work in customer service deal with so many people each day that I am a bit skeptical of them being able to accurately remember the exact time a customer frequented their store months beforehand. But if they are correct about the time, then Stephen has a 25 to 30 minute window which is unaccounted for, and you could easily believe it's somehow connected to the crime. If he hired someone to kill Marilu, perhaps he was making arrangements for them to enter the house and carry out the murder. If he shot Marilu himself, then maybe Stephen was using that time to dispose of the murder weapons. Well, that is not a large time frame to get rid of evidence. He could have done something as simple as hiding the guns in a dumpster or trash bin. If you remember the O.J. Simpson case, his alibi was that he was picked up from his house in a limousine and driven to Los Angeles International Airport for a late-night flight to Chicago shortly after the murders took place. It's been theorized that he used this opportunity to dispose of the murder weapon and other evidence in one of the airport trash cans, but by the time investigators put two and two together, all the trash had likely been picked up and the evidence was long gone. So a similar thing could have happened to the guns in this case. During the 2018 press conference, Marilu's brother, Louis, claimed that after Marilu was pronounced dead at the hospital, Stephen spent the night with their parents, and at no point did the police approach him about testing his hands for gunshot residue. If this is accurate, then they pretty much blew their chance to determine if Stephen fired a weapon that morning. This is a contrast to the aforementioned John Branyan case, where he flat out volunteered to take a gunshot residue test while police were questioning him, which could be interpreted as a sign that he hired someone to murder his wife and wanted to establish conclusive evidence that he could not have pulled the trigger himself. Louis also stated that Marilu would not have opened the door for someone she didn't know. Marilu kept a pistol in her purse, which was found inside the kitchen, so if someone entered the house and attacked her, it seems logical that she would have ran towards her purse. But her body was found inside a bathroom, which was located in the opposite direction, suggesting that someone took her by surprise while she was in there. This is why Louis is inclined to believe that Marilu was murdered in the early morning hours before Stephen left the house. It's true that there were no signs of forced entry and the door was found unlocked, but the alternate explanation is that Stephen arranged things that way. He claimed that the security system was on at the time he left, but we really only have his word on that, so for all we know, Stephen could have turned the system off and left the front door unlocked so that someone he hired could sneak inside the house and kill Marilu. According to Stephen, he was still in bed at around 6:30, so she very well could have woken up, laid out her jewelry she was planning to wear, and headed into the bathroom until an intruder suddenly appeared and shot her. Given that this house was located in an affluent suburban neighborhood, it's actually pretty surprising that no one reported hearing any gunshots that morning, which is unfortunate, since that might have made it easier to figure out when exactly Marilu was killed. There's also the fact that the paramedics injected a medication into Marilu's heart to resuscitate her, which ensured it would be impossible to determine her exact time of death. This is one point which makes me lean towards Stephen not committing the murder himself, because there's no way he could have anticipated this injection would happen. If investigators had been able to conclude that Marilu was shot before 6:30, this would have destroyed his alibi. But then again, Stephen may not have even known that medical science was capable of determining an exact time of death and never even took this into account. In which case, he just got extremely lucky that the injection took place. You could also read a lot into Stephen's phone call to Marilu from Precision Glass at 7:30 a.m. It's unclear if investigators checked phone records to verify if this call actually took place, but it always struck me as odd. Stephen's story was that while he was leaving, he told Marilu he would call her at 7 o'clock, but he lost track of time and didn't get around to doing it until 7:30. But why did Stephen feel the need to call his wife in the first place? He just saw her about an hour ago, so what exactly would they need to talk about? Did he really want to tell Marilu about all the donuts he just bought? If this crime was a hired hit, I think it's possible that Stephen was using this call to contact the killer, either to signal them to go into the house or to receive confirmation that the job was done. It was only 45 minutes later when Stephen phoned Maria to ask her to visit the house, and if this was planned, then I'm not sure he would have made this call unless he was certain that Marilu was already dead by that point. Regardless of whether Stephen committed the murder himself or hired someone to do it, or if he's completely innocent, the one part I've always found baffling is the fact that Marilu was shot with bullets from 2 different guns. This could mean that 2 separate people committed the crime together, or someone made the calculated decision to use 2 guns in order to create misdirection and confuse the investigation. If this was a hired hit, then I'm not sure why Stephen would feel the need to use 2 people, as that's an unnecessary additional person who knows what happened and could conceivably talk. My biggest issue with believing that Stephen is completely innocent in this whole thing is that it's so hard to come up with a logical alternate explanation which doesn't involve him. Why would a complete stranger enter a suburban home during the early morning hours and shoot an unarmed woman, particularly since she was not sexually assaulted and nothing was stolen? I know there are contradictory accounts of whether a robbery took place, as Stephen maintained during his Unsolved Mysteries interview that around $25,000 to $30,000 worth of valuables were stolen, but others clearly disagreed. This is supported by the fact that numerous pieces of jewelry were lying around in plain sight in the bedroom, so even if the perpetrator stole other stuff, why ignore these additional valuables which are just sitting there right in front of you? No, the suspected motive for this crime is that Stephen killed Marilu because he was experiencing financial difficulties and wanted to cash in on our $435,000 life insurance policy. It's interesting that Stephen offered a $50,000 reward for information, but then rescinded it after claiming he could not afford to pay the money. This could have been a calculated move to make himself look like the grieving husband who wants to solve his wife's murder, only for him to come up with a convenient excuse to withdraw the reward. In Stephen's defense, he did wait 10 months before he attempted to collect on the life insurance policy, and it was also taken out a full 2 years before the murder took place. I also think Stephen does make a bit of a valid point during his Unsolved Mysteries interview when discussing the wrongful death lawsuit filed against him by the Serratos. They ultimately reached an out-of-court settlement, but both sides denied that they were the one who proposed the initial offer, and we may never know the actual truth about that. Stephen stated, quote, "If it had been my daughter, and I thought that person was involved, there was no way I would ever take the settlement, but they did," end quote. And that does make sense. Even if Stephen was the one who originally proposed the settlement, the Serratos did not have to take it, especially if their goal was to seek justice for Marilu's murder. But to be fair, during the 2018 press conference, Diana Serrato clarified that her parents did not want to settle, but felt they had to do so because their attorneys convinced them it was the best course of action due to the uncertainty of how a trial could possibly go. She also gave off the impression that one of the main motivators for this legal battle was to change the name on Marilu's headstone from Marilu Geri to Marilu Serrato, and this eventually wound up happening anyway when the headstone was vandalized and stolen before it was replaced with a new one featuring her maiden name. However, one thing I find really interesting is that the settlement took place in May of 1987, and it was only 6 months later when Stephen was indicted for felony theft of $200,000 after he supplied false information on a loan application. Like I mentioned earlier, I unfortunately could not find out how that case ended up, or what legal consequences Stephen faced, though he was obviously still a free man when he recorded his Unsolved Mysteries interview sometime in 1988. But let's assume Stephen did steal that money. This could have been motivated by the fact that the settlement left him receiving less money from Marilu's life insurance than he expected. Remember, $200,000 is almost half of $435,000, so if Stephen needed more cash, this could have compelled him to orchestrate another scheme in order to get it. Of course, this is all just speculation on my part, since I'm not sure if Stephen was actually guilty of the felony theft. Whatever the case, Stephen Geri's former website painted a picture of him having lived a happy and successful life over the past 3 decades, and he may have believed that he put this chapter of his life completely behind him. But the good news is that the uploading of the Unsolved Mysteries segment seems to have reinvigorated the investigation since the anniversary press conference took place only 1 year later. Now obviously, this is going to be a tough case to solve after all this time. If Stephen committed the murder himself, then he seemed to do a very successful job of covering his tracks and leaving no evidence behind. But if he did hire someone to kill Marilu, then there is at least one additional person involved in this crime who could have conceivably talked at some point, and all it would take to close this case is for the right person to come forward. I don't know. Unless there was someone else out there with a motive to murder Marilu who has managed to slip under the radar all these years, then I just have a hard time imagining that a random intruder broke into her house that morning and shot her 4 times for no particular reason. So I'm sure you can easily deduce whom I believe was responsible for orchestrating this crime, though proving it might be an uphill battle. But if you happen to have any information on the unsolved murder of Marilu Geri, please contact the Fort Bend County Crime Stoppers at 281-342-TIPS. That's 281-342-8477. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, we are covering another story which was featured on Unsolved Mysteries about the bizarre failed ransom kidnapping of business executive John Grundhofer by an inept, unidentified criminal who somehow managed to avoid getting caught. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to take a moment to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Anne, John S., and Richard S. Thank you all so much for your support. I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.